Thank you for joining us once again today as we continue our series of lessons on the minor prophets. Today we have reached the book of Habakkuk. Have you ever wondered sometimes, to put it in modern language, what God is up to? You ever wondered what God is doing in our world? A lot of times we find ourselves asking questions that begin with the word why. Why is this happening in the world? Why is that happening? Why isn't something else happening? You know, when answers to those questions aren't easily found, sometimes we can get increasingly frustrated. When we try to analyze national events, when we try to analyze world affairs, sometimes it can almost drive you nuts. When you look at certain things that happen in the world and you wonder, why was that allowed to happen? Or you look at things that are happening and you ask and wonder, why isn't something else happening to counteract that? What's going on in the world? Well, if you've ever thought about questions like that and wondered about what God may be doing in His sovereign will and His providence, you're not alone. The prophet Habakkuk feels your pain. Other books, interestingly, show the prophets speaking for God to the people. The book of Habakkuk is unique in that it reveals a prophet who is not speaking for God to the people, he's speaking to God for the people. Habakkuk is going to take questions to God that he's struggling with as he tries to figure out what's going on in the world. As far as background is concerned, Habakkuk's name means embrace. We don't have a specific date for the book, but we know that Habakkuk did his work during Babylon's rise to world prominence, because God is going to mention that in His communication with Habakkuk. So it was probably just prior to the Babylonians' conquering of the Assyrians, which took place between 612 and 610 BC. And so let's do as we've done previously in our series. Let's just walk ourselves through the text, and we'll pull some practical lessons out in the process. And so we begin with chapter 1, where the prophet reflects on God's judgment against Judah. And basically the prophet begins by offering his complaint to God. Let's begin in verses 2 through 4 of chapter 1. O Lord, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear? Even cry out to you violence, and you will not save. Why do you show me iniquity, and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are before me, there is strife, and contention arises. Therefore the law is powerless, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, therefore perverse judgment proceeds. As we've seen from studying previous prophets, at the time that Habakkuk is doing his work and working as a prophet, things in Judah are really pretty bad. And Judah is destined for captivity. And for some time, evidently, the prophet had wanted to know why God was not doing anything in response to Judah's wickedness. And so that's how the prophet begins, is with this complaint to God of why God isn't doing anything. And so he asks Him, how long shall I cry and you not hear? I cry out to you violence. In other words, this is what I'm seeing. I'm seeing violence, and he goes on to describe injustice, disregard for the law. And from Habakkuk's perspective, God seems very unconcerned. When Habakkuk looked at the situation in Judah, he couldn't see any evidence himself that God was doing anything about that. And Habakkuk is concerned because he knows God to be just. He knows God to be one who, as he'll say in a moment, is of purer eyes than to look upon evil. He knows that to be God's nature. And so he can't harmonize what he knows to be true about God and what he thinks he's seeing in the culture around him. You ever been that way? You ever had similar thoughts? I have. When I look around our nation sometimes and I see the things that are happening in our world where people just completely disregard God's law, they disregard God's will for the home, they disregard God's desire for marriage and what constitutes a legitimate right marriage. And people disregard God's will concerning all manner of other things. And so you look around that and you think to yourself sometimes, why hasn't God brought some kind of judgment or justice to this? How long will He allow His glory and His majesty to be trampled? How long? Well, that was Habakkuk's question. How long will I cry and you not hear? He says, look, the law seems powerless. So all of that was happening, and God seemed to the prophet unconcerned, and the prophet has finally verbalized that to God. Well, in verses 5 through 11 of chapter 1, God offers His response. And He says in verse 5, look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded, for I will work a work in your days which you would not believe, though it were told you. That's a powerful passage to me. When God says to the prophet in response, God, why are you not doing anything? Why are you allowing all this violence and this disregard for your law to go, and you seem to be doing nothing about that? God says, look out into the nations and watch. It reminds me of something my own dad used to say to me and to my brothers. If we ever exhibited any kind of doubt that he might not follow through with something that he said he was going to do, he'd always say to us, hey, you just hide and watch. Well, essentially, that's what God has told the prophet to do. You just hide and watch. You sit back and watch what's happening in the nations. And He said, I'm working something in your day that you would not believe if I told you what I was doing. I want you to let that sink in for a moment. If God actually revealed everything that He was doing in the world at that time, He said to Habakkuk, you wouldn't believe me if I told you. I wonder if there's not a modern application for us. We don't know everything that God is doing in His providence in the world today. He hasn't revealed that to us. We know some things just in a general way from what the Scriptures have revealed, but there are things that the Bible just doesn't reveal to us. And how God may be in His providence working certain things out in our world, God hasn't revealed all of that. And it might even be the case that if God were today to, and I know He's not going to do this, but just for the sake of argument, if God were to open up the heavens and just speak audibly to the world and say, all right, here's what I'm doing in the world today in my providence, I wonder how many of us would not believe what He told us, even if He did tell us. Well, that's what He told Habakkuk. He said, I'm working something in your day you wouldn't believe me if I told you. And then he goes on to describe it, at least in some detail. He doesn't reveal everything about it, but he says in verse 6, for indeed I am raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation which marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. And he describes them further. Verse 7, they're terrible and dreadful. Verse 8, their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than wolves. Their chargers, their horsemen charge ahead. The cavalry comes from afar. They fly as the eagle that hastens to eat. Into verse 9, they gather captives like sand. They scoff at kings. He just describes them as being a terrible nation as far as conquering is concerned. But his point is, look, here's some of what I'm doing. I'm in the process, God says, of bringing up the Chaldeans. That's the Babylonians. And I am raising them up, raising them to the forefront of world affairs. And they were going to be God's tool of punishment for Judah. So remember, get the context of these first few verses. Habakkuk is concerned that God is not active, that God is unconcerned and not really doing anything about the sin that is so prevalent in Judah. Violence, disregard for God's law, all of that. Habakkuk says, God, why aren't you doing anything? And God's response is, I am doing something. You just don't see it yet. I'm raising up the Chaldeans, and I'm going to use them to bring judgment to Judah. And so, with that description, Habakkuk gets some news that he didn't know about. The Chaldeans were marching through the earth, verse 6. They are possessing dwelling places that are not theirs, and he describes how terrible they are, all of that. So now Habakkuk is more informed than he was previously, but that just leads to a second complaint. Now Habakkuk is even more confused than he was before. Look at verses 12 through 17 and see his complaint. First of all, he confesses what he knows to be true about God. Are you not from everlasting? O Lord my God, my Holy One. All right, so he recognizes God's eternity, and he confesses, right? You've appointed them for judgment, O Lord, middle of the verse. You've marked them for correction. He's basically saying, okay, I get that. I understand that you've marked them out for correction. But here's where his confusion comes in. He says in verse 13 concerning what he knows about God, you are of purer eyes than to behold evil, and cannot look on wickedness. The idea is to look favorably upon it. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? Here's the problem that Habakkuk is having. He confesses his belief in the eternality of God, in the holiness of God, and so obviously he trusts that God knows what He's doing, but here's his confusion. He says, how can you, a God of holiness, a God of purer eyes than to look upon evil, how can you hold your tongue, into verse 13, how can you hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? He's talking about Babylon. God, how can you use a nation more wicked than Judah to punish Judah? Yes, he confesses, I know Judah is guilty of sin. He's just gone through that in the first part of the chapter. All this violence and wickedness and disregard for God's law. He knows that Judah is sinful, but then he looks at the Chaldeans and he says, well, but how can you use them? They're more wicked than Judah is. So just what God said to him was, I'm working something out that you wouldn't believe me if I told you. And then he reveals some of it to him, and Habakkuk's response, he doesn't get it. He understands what God's doing, but he doesn't understand how God can harmonize that with His own nature. You ever been there? You ever looked around and seen a nation of people that seems to be characterized mostly by wickedness, and they seem to be getting the upper hand in world affairs, and nations that tend to be more righteous in their character are not? Well, if you've ever thought about that, so did Habakkuk. He was struggling with that, trying to figure out what God was doing and why God was doing it the way He was. And so God's judgment against Judah is addressed in chapter 1. Now we move to chapter 2. And well, first notice verse 17 of chapter 1, just to kind of wrap this up on this section. He says, shall they therefore empty their net and continue to slay nations without pity? His point there, he's talking about the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, and how they are gathering up people like you gather up fish in a net. And God had said they're going about the earth and they're devouring nations. And Habakkuk says, all right, so they're collecting people from these nations like you collect fish in a net. Here's the question, shall they therefore then empty their net of everything they've collected so far and then continue to slay nations without pity? God, are you going to just allow them to do this, as wicked as they are? That's the question he's dealing with. Now chapter 2. Habakkuk begins by saying, all right, I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart and watch to see what He will say to me and what I will answer when I'm corrected. He says, all right, I've made my case. I've made my case before God. Now I'm going to sit back and see what God has to say in response to that, and how I might then respond to what He says. And so God then gives him an answer, beginning in verse number 2, and He says to him, write the vision and make it plain on tablets, that he may run who reads it. For, he says, the vision is yet for an appointed time. End of verse 3, it will surely come, it will not tarry. So basically, God is saying to the prophet, write down what I'm about to tell you, make it plain, and realize that this is something that is going to come at some point in the future. The vision is for a yet appointed time. In other words, it's going to be in the future sometime, but it is going to happen. And he goes on to describe how Babylon has become so puffed up with pride. And certainly Habakkuk's assessment of them is accurate. They are far from an upright nation. They're drunk on their own power, to use his terminology in the first 5 verses. They're never satisfied with what they've conquered. They just want more. Look at this in verse 5. Indeed, because he transgresses by wine, he's talking about the Babylonians. He's a proud man. He does not stay at home. He enlarges his desire as hell. He's like death and cannot be satisfied. People are constantly dying, right? It's like death, can't be satisfied. That's the Babylonians that he's describing there. And so, drunk on their own power, never satisfied with what they have. And he goes on to say, woe to him, verse 6, woe to him who increases what is not his. How long? And to him who loads himself with many pledges. He announces basically 5 statements of woe, statements of destruction that are going to come on Babylon in verses 6 through 20. And the first one in verses 6 through 8, woe to a nation, basically, to put it in modern language, woe to the nation that builds its empire by taking land to which he has no right and overtaxing its subjects. Right? He speaks of them increasing in what is not his, right? Taking stuff that doesn't belong to him, loading himself with many pledges, right? Taxes. Well, Babylon was guilty of that. They were eating up the land, taking what really wasn't theirs, overtaxing its subjects. The second statement of destruction in verses 9 through 11, woe to a nation that destroys others just to make itself secure. Look at verse 9. Woe to him who covets evil gain for his house and cuts off many peoples. In verse number 10, they were trying to make themselves secure by overtaking others. What about verses 12 through 14? Woe to a nation that builds itself through bloodshed and sin. Look beginning in verse 12. Woe to him who builds a town with bloodshed, who establishes a city by iniquity. Well, that's what Babylon was doing. And he pronounces destruction on them. Woe to a man, verses 15 through 17, that intoxicates his neighbor, that he might take advantage of him. Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbor. Into the verse, that you may look on his nakedness. You're filled with shame instead of glory. His point there is, any individual that would intoxicate his neighbor for the purpose of taking advantage of them is ultimately going to be doomed to destruction himself. Well, again, this is in the context of him describing the sins of the Babylonians. Now in verses 18 through 20, woe to those who call upon idols for help. Look at those verses. Chapter 2, verse 18. What profit is the image, that its maker should carve it? The molded image, a teacher of lies, that the maker of its mold should trust in it to make mute idols. Woe to him who says to wood, awake, to silent stone, arise, it shall teach. Behold, it's overlaid with gold and silver, yet in it there is no breath at all. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Babylonians were guilty of idolatry, and the prophet here pronounces destruction on them for that. But it's interesting how he describes idolatry and really the sheer foolishness of it in verse 18. What profit is the image, that its maker should carve it, and that the maker of its mold should trust in it? What sense does it make for a person to take a piece of stone or a piece of wood and carve some image out of it, with the one doing the carving in complete and total control of that object, and then once it's been carved, he turns around and bows down to that thing as if it has some kind of power? Verse 19, woe to him who says to wood, awake, or to stone, arise. He said there's no breath in it at all. There's no life in it. So why would they do that? Well, it's just the stupidity of idolatry. But he says in verse 20, but the Lord is in his holy temple. Let the earth keep silence before him. In other words, let's all recognize that even though idols have no breath, no life in them, God is alive. And we should all humbly be silent before him and listen to what he has to say. So, as we kind of wrap up chapter 2, we see what God has told to Habakkuk, essentially an answer to his question of how can you use a nation more wicked than Judah to punish Judah. And God's answer basically, if you want to capsule chapter 2, God's answer is basically that, you know what, the Babylons are going to get theirs. The Babylonians are wicked, and He described their wickedness, but He pronounces all of these woes on them, statements of destruction. And He's basically saying, look, the Babylonians are going to face their punishment too, just like Judah is. So it's not that God is turning a deaf ear or a blind eye to what the Babylonians are doing. He's just simply saying the Babylonians are going to face judgment too, but it will be on my timetable when the time is right. And so now Habakkuk has greater perspective. And that leads us into what we know as chapter 3, where Habakkuk then offers his statement, his prayer, if you will, of faith and confidence in God. Now let's look at chapter 3 and draw some lessons from that too. It's identified as a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet. And so this is Habakkuk kind of taking everything that God has said to him and reasoning through it and coming to his conclusion about how much he ought to trust in God. And so let's look at chapter 3, first of all, the first couple of verses. Well, verse 2 specifically. O Lord, I have heard your speech and was afraid. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. Isn't that interesting? As Habakkuk contemplates what God has said, he confesses that the report of what God is doing in the world causes him to tremble. He said, I've heard your speech, God, and it caused me to fear. It caused me to tremble. And he recognizes that God is going to bring justice into the lives of the nation of Judah as well as ultimately in Babylon. And so God's going to judge both of those nations. And he says at the end of verse 2, in wrath, remember mercy. He knows that these nations have to be punished, but he calls upon God to be as merciful in that process as he possibly can be. And then in verse 3 and following, you have the real content, the meat of his prayer. And in that section 3 through 13 or so, he recalls God's past work among the people. Talks about God's nature and how God has been active, going all the way back to Egypt and all the way up to the present. Just look at some of the things that he says about God in beginning of verse 3. His glory covered the heavens. The earth was full of His praise. His brightness, verse 4, was like the light. End of verse 4. There His power was hidden. Verse 6, He stood and measured the earth. His ways are everlasting. End of verse 6. He goes on, verse number 10, the mountains saw you and trembled. The overflowing of the water passed by. Sun and the moon stood still, verse 11. And you marched through the land with indignation. He goes back, he's just recalling how God has been active and working in the nations throughout history. But he concludes kind of that idea of God's working in the past with verse 13 when he says, you went forth for the salvation of your people, for salvation with your anointed. So basically God's work in the past, the prophet now sees, was all for a purpose. It was all for God's anointed. It was all for the salvation of your people, for the good of your people. So even when God brings judgment to Judah, the prophet understands that God is doing that because that's what Judah needs. It's not going to be pleasant or enjoyable for them to go through, but it's discipline that they need. And so it's all for the salvation and deliverance of the people and for God's anointed. And so he says in verse 16, again kind of summarizing, when I heard, my body trembled, my lips quivered at the voice, rottenness entered my bones, and I trembled in myself that I might rest in the day of trouble. When he comes up to the people, he will invade them with his troops. And so he recognizes that God's going to do this, but it causes him to tremble when he thinks about it. I suspect that would happen to us too if we were made privy to God's activity in the world, that we would tremble at what God was doing. Well, Habakkuk confesses that that's his response, but he's resigned to that. And so in verses 17 through 19 of chapter 3 is, in my estimation, one man's opinion, but I think this is one of, if not the greatest statement on genuine faith that you find in at least the Old Testament and maybe even in the Bible as a whole. Notice what he says. Though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, and the fields yield no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength. He will make my feet like deer's feet, and He will make me walk on the high hills. Habakkuk resolves that he's going to trust in God, and he's going to rejoice in God's will, even if every material source of comfort and prosperity is taken from him. Think about that for a moment. As he contemplates what God is doing, and as he thinks about how God is going to bring judgment into the nation of Judah first, Babylon then later, he says, you know what? Things may get bad. Things may get bad in the nation, and material prosperity may become very scarce. And so he talks about how it may be that the fig tree doesn't blossom. There's no fruit on the vines. And he goes on about the fields yielding no food, the flocks being cut off. He said, even if all of that happens, I will still rejoice in the Lord. We might put it this way, even if there's no food on the table or money in the bank, I will still rejoice and find occasion for joy in the God of my salvation. Habakkuk had traveled from one place to the next, spiritually speaking. When we began the book, we noticed that Habakkuk was dealing, first of all, with perplexing questions. He was upset. His soul was troubled. And so he came to God and said, God, why are you not doing anything? When all this violence is all around, this disregard for your law, he had all of these troubling questions. And he went from that to a calmness of soul where he could say, whatever happens, I'm going to rejoice in the God of my salvation. What a great journey he made in this short amount of time. Well, as we wrap this thing up, a couple of lessons I want you to think about. Number one, it's not wrong to have questions. God gave us the ability to subject our circumstances to meaningful analysis. So it's not wrong to have questions. But some questions have answers that we're not capable of understanding. And we need to recognize that and accept that. But in every crisis, God can be trusted. And so Habakkuk 2 verse 4 says, the just shall live by faith. If we want to live the way God expects us to, we trust Him with every ounce of our being. That's the lesson Habakkuk learned, and I hope we'll learn it too.